Well, let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Mark and chapter 15. For some people, today is of no significance whatsoever. For others, there is a great opportunity to have a break from work, spend time with the family, and eat more chocolate than usual. While for others still, it is of enormous significance because of what happened on this day 2,000 years ago. And so there is quite a spectrum of how people see this day. And that broad spectrum of significance which people attach to this day, it shouldn't really surprise us because there was a huge spectrum in the significance which people attached to the very first Good Friday. And what we are going to do this morning is we are going to listen to Mark's description of various people's assessment of the events which took place on that Friday 2,000 years ago. And the first of those is in verses 25 to 32, and there we see the dismissive attitude of the crowd. The dismissive attitude of the crowd. Now, having been arrested, Jesus appeared before a Jewish religious court known as the Sanhedrin. They came to the conclusion that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy, and so they condemned him as being worthy of death. But as Israel was occupied by the Romans at that time, the Sanhedrin had no authority to carry out the death penalty. And so Mark tells us in the opening verse of chapter 15 that the religious authorities turned Jesus over to Pilate, Pilate being the Roman governor at that time. Now, as Mark records in verse 10, Pilate was well aware that the Jewish leaders had no legal grounds for condemning Jesus to death, but rather it was out of envy that they handed Jesus over to him. And Mark makes the point that Pilate knew that perfectly well. And yet, rather than dismiss their accusation, rather than dismiss their charge, rather than release Jesus, which would have been the right thing and the just thing to do, Pilate seeks to please the crowd. He asks the crowd, a crowd which had been influenced and stirred up by the religious leaders, he asked the crowd, what shall I do then with the one you call King of the Jews? And in reply they shouted, crucify him. Crucify him. And so from verse 16 onwards, we read of the Roman soldiers preparing Jesus for death. They put a purple robe on him in mockery. They put a crown of thorns on his head, and in mockery they cry out, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck him on the head, they spat on him, and they eventually brought him to a place called Golgotha, and there they crucified him. It was 9 a.m, and not a public holiday in those days. And so there were plenty of people around to witness the death of Jesus. It wasn't something that happened in secret. There were plenty of people to witness it. And we are told in verse 29, those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, so, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself. They remember a remarkable claim that Jesus once made, and they assume that his presence on that cross now demonstrates the utter foolishness of Jesus having made that claim. If he's not strong enough to come down from the cross, they thought, what chance has he got of fulfilling that claim that he once made about rebuilding the temple? And so they dismiss Jesus as someone whose remarkable claims have been proved to be false and empty and foolish as a result of him hanging on the tree. on the cross. They assume his death demonstrates that at the end of the day, he's no different from anyone else. No different. And we're told in verse 31, it wasn't just the average person who thought that. Verse 31 says, in the same way, the chief priests and teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they said, but he can't save himself. Let this Christ, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe. Then a third group of people, those who were crucified with him, they also heaped insults on him. People from across society, they recalled some of the spectacular claims that Jesus made during his lifetime, claims to be a king, claims to be the Messiah, claims to be the Son of God, claims to be a Saviour. But the fact that he cannot now save himself demonstrates, as far as they are concerned, the futility and the stupidity and the emptiness of all that he has claimed throughout his life. The fact that he is dying like everyone else, they thought, proves that he's no different from everyone else. That was the dismissive attitude of the crowd back then. And it may be that their attitude, it may just be that their attitude is your attitude this morning. 2,000 years on, and you find many people who have a very similar attitude and response about the death of Jesus. Chatting to a funeral director the other day, I asked him if he was busy. And in reply, he said, sadly, yes. Funeral directors are always busy. Have you ever noticed that? They belong to the one profession that will never be short of work, for the simple reason that people keep dying. People die sooner or later, and when it's sooner rather than later, we get a bit of a shock because it reminds us that we are all part of that frightening statistic which says, you know the most reliable statistic that there is? 1 out of 1 dies. That is the true statistic that was ever produced. 1 out of 1 dies. And it may just be that your awareness of that grim reality, it may just be that causes you to think that there is nothing special about this day. In view of the fact that everyone dies sooner or later, you may be thinking to yourself, why all the fuss about that one man's death from 2,000 years ago? Why all the fuss? Although the court case that led to Jesus' death sentence may have been a bit of a sham, and although his death may have come a bit sooner than necessary, doesn't his death simply confirm that statistic, that 1 out of 1 dies? And what is more, you may be thinking to yourself, doesn't his death confirm that at the end of the day, Jesus was no different from the rest of us? And so his death causes you to dismiss both the significance of this day and the many remarkable claims that he made throughout his life. That continues to be the dismissive attitude of the crowd today. And it may just be that you are amongst the crowd. Moving on, secondly, verses 33 to 38, and there we see the decisive action of God. The decisive action of God. Now, if you want to understand the true significance of any event in the history of our world, then the best place to look is not so much at the significance which men and women have attached to it. The best place to look is not at the history books. The best place to look is rather to see what is the significance that God has attached to it. And that is certainly true of this event from 2,000 years ago that we are considering this morning. What is the significance that God attached to the death of Jesus? But how, you may be thinking to yourself, how can we possibly know what significance he attached to that occasion? Well, if you look at verses 33 to 38, you'll see that Mark has recorded two things which God did back then. This is not what Pilate did. This is not what the crowds did. This is not what the soldiers did. This is two things that God did. Two things which demonstrate the significance of that occasion from God's perspective. The first is in verse 33, where we read, "At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour." Now, the Jewish clock, I know this weekend our clocks go forward and it causes all sorts of confusion. Well, the Jewish clock was a little bit different from ours again. And the 6th hour to the 9th hour was actually from 12 noon through to 3 p.m. And as you know, that is when the sun would have been at its brightest and its hottest. And yet we are told in verse 33 that a darkness came over the whole land for those 3 hours. No, it wasn't an eclipse of the sun, not at that time of year. And so what was the significance of that darkness? We are familiar with people's deaths being marked in all sorts of ways. When someone who's very prominent in our society dies, their death might just possibly be marked by a 21-gun salute. But how many people in history have had their death marked by the entire country being plunged into 3 hours of darkness at the brightest and hottest time of the day? How many people in the history of our world have had their death marked in that way? No one, apart from Jesus. And that ought to make us sit up and realize that there is something unique about the death of Jesus, a uniqueness that was marked by those 3 hours of darkness. But still, you may be asking the question, well, what is the significance of that darkness? Well, what is worth remembering is that Jesus died at the time of the Jewish Passover, when the people would be remembering their deliverance from Egypt 1,500 or so years previously during the time of Moses. That was the original Passover. And as they thought back to that original Passover, they would remember that their deliverance from Egypt was preceded by 10 plagues which God brought upon the land of Egypt. Those 10 plagues were acts of divine judgment. And the 9th of those 10 plagues was a plague of darkness, when God brought complete darkness over the land of Egypt for 3 whole days. 3 whole days. The land of Egypt was covered in darkness. And here on this Friday 2,000 years ago, there is a complete darkness once again. Well, not this time upon the land of Egypt, but upon the land of Israel. And once again, it is an act of divine judgment. The difference this time is that it's not an entire nation that is experiencing the judgment of God, but an individual person. An individual person. And who could that be? Well, just listen to what Mark tells us in the next verse, verse 34. At the 9th hour, i.e. at the end of the 3 hours of darkness, Jesus cries out in a loud voice, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? It was Jesus who was experiencing the judgment of God on that day, on that occasion, and the 3 hours of darkness brought about by God demonstrates that is the significance that God attached to the death of Jesus. The darkness and the cry of forsakenness at the end of the darkness indicates that in his death upon the cross, Jesus was suffering under the judgment of God. And on hearing that, you may be thinking to yourself, why? What had he done wrong? What had he done to deserve that? And the answer is nothing. Nothing. Jesus had not only done nothing wrong in the eyes of a Roman governor, he had also done nothing wrong in the eyes of a holy God. And yet, as he hung upon that cross, he suffered the judgment of God. He did so because he had gone to that cross in the place of others. He had gone to that cross in the place of guilty sinners like you and me. He had gone to that cross as the sinner's substitute. And in doing so, he took upon himself the divine judgment that was deserved and ought to have been experienced by the sinner. Sinners just like you and me. That is what Jesus' cry of forsakenness confirms. That is what the 3 hours of darkness demonstrated. That is the significance which God attached to the death of Jesus. And if you want to know what that death in the place of others has accomplished, then just look at the other thing which God did on that occasion. In verse 37, Mark tells us that with a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. And then we read in verse 38, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Please note, as Jesus dies on a hill outside Jerusalem, at the moment he dies on that hill outside Jerusalem, something miraculous takes place in the center of Jerusalem. And I say something miraculous takes place because that temple curtain, it was not a light, flimsy sort of curtain that you and I have hanging on the windows in our houses. That was a massive, thick, heavy-duty curtain which would have been 30 feet high, 30 feet wide, and historians reckon it would have been somewhere in the region of 4 inches thick. And yet, the moment Jesus dies, it is torn in two from top to bottom. The tearing of that curtain was something which God did. And he did it to teach us the true significance of the death of Jesus. That curtain separated the main temple area from a special area of the temple which was known as the Holy of Holies. It was there that God had presenced himself in a special way. And that curtain was a constant reminder that sinful men and women were separated and cut off from a holy God because of their sin. That curtain acted as a barrier between sinners and God. But the tearing of that curtain at the moment of Jesus' death demonstrates that in his death, Jesus has opened the way for sinners like us to approach a holy God and to be reconciled to a holy God. Having suffered the judgment of God in the sinner's place, Jesus has dealt with that barrier between us and God, and he has made reconciliation with God, and he has made fellowship with God a glorious possibility. That is what Jesus was accomplishing in his death. And the 3 hours of darkness and the tearing of that curtain, two things which God did, the 3 hours of darkness and the tearing of that curtain demonstrates that that is the significance that God attached to the events of that first Good Friday. If we want to know the true significance of what happened on that day 2,000 years ago, then look at the decisive action of God on that occasion. Thirdly and finally, verses 39 to 41, and there we see the devoted admiration of Jesus' followers. The devoted admiration of Jesus' followers. Now, although the vast majority of people who witnessed the death of Jesus are described in verse 29, where it says that those who passed by hurled their insults at him, there were others whose attitude that day was different. For example, verse 40 tells us that some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. These were women who had come to believe and trust in Jesus sometime earlier, long before his arrival in Jerusalem. Their loyal devotion to him was not only evident back then in that they cared for his practical needs, it was also evident now in that while the masses are shouting abuse at Jesus, these women, they haven't fled the scene, which would have been the easiest thing to do. They haven't fled the scene. But instead, they're standing at a distance, waiting and watching the one that they've come to trust and follow. They're waiting and they're watching him suffer such a painful and humiliating death. Their prior loyalty to Jesus is now being tested to the limit. And they are demonstrated in the most hostile of environments. They are demonstrating their devoted admiration of him. But although those women had been followers of Jesus for some time, not everyone that Mark tells us about had such a long track record of following Jesus. Did you notice the other person that we read about in verse 39? And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus heard his cry and saw how he died, he said, Surely this man was the Son of God. Here is another follower of Jesus, a new follower of Jesus. And the contrast between those women and this centurion could hardly be greater. Just in case you think that all Christians are all the same, then here's something to think about. The contrast amongst these followers of Jesus back then couldn't have been more different. Whereas they were women, this is the obvious difference, whereas they were women, he was a man. Whereas they were Jewish women, he was a Gentile man. Whereas they were kind, gentle, considerate women who were concerned for Jesus' practical needs over a long period of time, here was just in case you think Christianity is for wimps only, here was a rough, tough, hardened Roman soldier who no doubt had witnessed many an execution without even blinking an eye. And yet when he heard Jesus' cries from the cross, and when he saw how he died, he realized that this was an execution, the likes of which he had never witnessed before. Having witnessed those 3 hours of extraordinary darkness, and having heard that cry of forsakenness which Jesus made from the cross, this soldier realized that there was something different. There was something unique about the death of this Jesus, and there was something unique about this Jesus himself, so much so that he comes to the conclusion, verse 39, surely this man was the Son of God. And in saying that, he too was expressing his newfound devotion and admiration as a follower of Jesus. The circumstances surrounding Jesus' death and the nature of his death and the manner in which he died, they all pointed, as far as this soldier was concerned, to the uniqueness of Jesus and to the uniqueness of his death upon the cross. Now, please note the contrast between this man and the crowd that we thought about a little earlier. Whereas the crowd thought that the death of Jesus demonstrated that he was no different from anyone else, this Roman soldier has come to the conclusion that the death of Jesus demonstrates that he was like no one else. Do you see that contrast? I'll repeat it. Whereas the crowd, they thought that the death of Jesus demonstrated that he was no different from anyone else. This Roman soldier has come to the conclusion that the death of Jesus demonstrates that he is like no one else. And many years later, that is still the opposite responses which the death of Jesus brings out in people today. As I said earlier, some people think that his death demonstrates that he was no different from us, and therefore they would say, why make so much fuss about his death when people are dying every day? Whereas others today are like this Roman soldier, in that they consider the circumstances of his death, and they come to the conclusion that this Jesus and his death are unique in the history of our world. And which of those two responses to the death of Jesus, I wonder, which of those two responses will be your response today? Will you dismiss those events as 2,000 years ago as being just one more death in the history of our world, a world in which everyone dies sooner or later anyway? Or will you pause to consider the exceptional circumstances of his death, especially those things that God did on that occasion, the 3 hours of darkness and the tearing of that curtain in the temple? And having considered those unique events which accompanied the death of Jesus, will you consider the uniqueness of Jesus himself? The unique claims which he made during his life on this earth, claims to be the Messiah, claims to be the Son of God, claims to be the Saviour of the world. Will you come to see, like the Roman centurion, that far from proving the emptiness of all those claims, his death on the cross actually demonstrates the truthfulness of those claims? For example, it was by suffering the judgment of God during those 3 hours of darkness that his claim to be the Saviour of the world is a valid claim. It's because he suffered the judgment of God during those 3 hours of darkness that this Jesus is the Saviour of all who put their trust in him. And so, that being the case, will you, like the centurion, come to trust this Jesus for yourself and trust in his punishment-bearing death as being the only means by which you can have your sin forgiven and be reconciled to a holy God? What will your response be 2,000 years on to the death of Jesus? Will you dismiss it like the crowd did? Or will you come to trust in this Jesus for yourself, as the Roman centurion did? Three things we see in Mark's account of the crucifixion. We see the dismissive attitude of that crowd. We see the direct action of God. We see the devoted admiration of Jesus' followers.